In our last study, we traced the history of Abraham's descendants and found out why there will be no peace in the Middle East anytime soon. This is the conflict that has been going on for thousands of years, starting with one family, Abraham's. We determined that the promises God gave to Abraham, many of which have yet to be fulfilled, are still designated to go to Isaac's seed. In part 2 of Abraham's Descendants, we will go over Isaac's lineage and who they are today. Are the Jews who are currently fighting to establish their state Isaac's seeds? What does the Bible say? Who will finally inherit the Holy Land? And before we get started, let me just say that this study emphatically teaches the Bible just as it reads, and as we believe it is divinely interpreted. There are many who have taken the Palestinian side or pro-Israeli, and we are saddened by the loss of life on both sides. This study does not endeavor to dehumanize one side or the other. We're not taking sides. It seeks to clarify long misinterpreted applications and help bring an end to the strife through the truth. It may seem to some a hopeless cause, for we know there will be a gigantic war in the Middle East surrounding Jerusalem. God says he will gather all nations at Jerusalem. But we also know that both Palestinians and Israelis and all others who call the Middle East home have an opportunity to welcome Jesus in their heart and enter his kingdom when he calls. Now that we have that established, okay, who of Abraham's seed are the children of promise? We know that it only can come from the line of Isaac, okay, the 12 tribes of Israel. We must fast forward to see what happened to them. So fast forward, after the 12 tribes are created, they are called Israelites. They become a nation. They become a great people in Egypt. They leave Egypt and go to take the promised land, but they do not retain it because of their own unfaithfulness. We see that in time, the children of Israel apostatized, and God drove Israel, 10 tribes, from his holy land by Assyria. That's in 2 Kings 18, verses 9 through 12. And because they were driven out, they assimilated into those Gentile nations and they lost their racial identity. Now there are only 2 tribes left, the 2-tribe kingdom of Judah. But Judah is unfaithful as well, so he also allows Judah, the 2-tribe kingdom, to go into captivity. First they go under Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Grecia, and then by the time of Christ, Rome. This is found in 2 Kings chapter 24. So then the Messiah comes, Jesus. He comes to not all 12 tribes, it's just the 2 tribes, right? The 2 tribes, the two-tribe kingdom of Judah he comes to. That's all that's left by the time Jesus comes. He comes to redeem them. But they rejected and crucified him. So what happens because of that rejections? We're going to look closely at this. After the crucifixion of Jesus, and then the subsequent continued rejection of the gospel by the Jews. Remember, they persecuted the apostles and early Christians, and the gospel goes out to the Gentiles. And during the time of the Christian era, up until the latter days, almost 2,000 years, the Christian Jews lost their racial identity by marrying Gentiles. We see an intermingling of the Christian Jews with Gentiles. Let's go back to a time when the Jews and Christians start to diverge significantly in their beliefs, which in many ways motivates their migration patterns. Yet, their communities will remain intertwined in that the Christians initially focused their missionary efforts on their Jewish brethren. The destruction of Jerusalem.
Not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Christ had given his disciples warning, and all who believed his words watched for the promised sign. "When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies," said Jesus, "then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out." Luke 21:20-21. After the Romans under Cestius had surrounded the city, they unexpectedly abandoned the siege when everything seemed favorable for an immediate attack. The besieged, despairing of successful resistance, were on the point of surrender, when the Roman general withdrew his forces without the least apparent reason. But God's merciful providence was directing events for the good of his own people. The promised sign had been given to the waiting Christians, and now an opportunity was offered for all who would, to obey the Savior's warning. Events were so overruled that neither Jews nor Romans should hinder the flight of the Christians. Upon the retreat of Cestius, the Jews, sallying from Jerusalem, pursued after his retiring army. And while both forces were thus fully engaged, the Christians had an opportunity to leave the city. At this time, the country also had been cleared of enemies who might have endeavored to intercept them. At the time of the siege, the Jews were assembled at Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and thus the Christians throughout the land were able to make their escape unmolested. Without delay, they fled to a place of safety, the city of Pella, in the land of Perea, beyond Jordan. The Greek word diaspora means a scattering, and indeed there was a scattering of Jews throughout the known Greek and Roman world from the 3rd century BC and on down. There's a famous utterance by Strabo, a Greek geographer of the late 1st century BC, who says that you can't go anywhere in the civilized world without encountering a Jew. And by his time, this certainly was true. There were large Jewish communities in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, but even throughout the countryside, up the Nile Valley. There were large Jewish communities in Syria, a very large one in the city of Antioch, but throughout Syria, and there were numerous Jewish communities throughout Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, just as there were Jewish communities in Greece and throughout the Italian peninsula, most especially, of course, in the city of Rome. Even further west, we know about Jews in southern France, and Jews in Marseille, and perhaps even Jews in Spain. It's interesting to note that early Christianity first spread in those areas where there was a Jewish presence. That is, it spreads in Egypt, it spreads in Syria, it spreads in Asia Minor, it spreads in Greece and Italy. These are precisely areas where we know there were Jewish communities, there were Jewish synagogues, and there were Jews in number scattered throughout all these areas.
When we see the Christians beginning to spread out beyond the original homeland environment, they're following a pathway that had already been well-trod before them by other Jews. By the middle of the 1st century, there are probably more Jews living outside of the homeland than actually live back in Judah proper. This is what we call the diaspora, that is, the dispersion of Jewish population throughout the empire, and we know that there are major Jewish communities in most of the large cities of the empire, all the way from the Persian Gulf on the east to Spain on the west. It's an extensive diffusion of the Jewish population throughout the Roman. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote that there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond Euphrates till now and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers.
Now, there's a basic misunderstanding, a mistaken application that almost the entire Christian world believes about which Jews are blessed. They misapply that to the Jews that are currently in Palestine, okay? And this misapplication is the cause of the current world clashes in the Middle East, the clash where America, the last king of the North, is supporting the state of Israel with arms and military might against the other descendants of Abraham, the modern-day Ishmaelites, the Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites. For this misapplication to be corrected, it needs to be understood that the identifiable Jews there in Israel now rejected their Messiah, Jesus, and after a time, the Lord rejected them and chose the Christian Jews as his people. This is clear in the Bible, both through prophecy and explicit instruction. The time frame that the Jewish people had to repent is seen in the 2300 days prophecy of Daniel 8 and 9. God gave a pre-designated time for Israel to reconcile their sins as a nation. Their probation ended in 34 AD as they rejected the preaching of the apostles and put them to death. This is found in Daniel 9:24 and Acts 13:46, which states,
70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks.
Thus, the promises in the Bible to Judah and Israel in the latter days do not apply to them, but to the Christian Jews. This is when the blessings are transferred from the Israelites to the Christian Jews. And where are the Christian Jews now? They are in one of the Christian churches. Who are they? Only God knows the generations of these Christian Jews who look like Gentiles that have descended from the seed of Abraham. He knows Jesus' generation back to David, to Abraham, and to Adam. In this genealogical record, he knows every Christian Jew who married Gentiles and lost their racial identity, and who descended down to our day, who are in his true church, and who will be sealed as one of the 144,000. And from our previous studies, we know that out of the Protestant Reformation were birthed 6 divinely established churches: the Lutherans by Martin Luther, the Presbyterians, John Knox, the Methodists, John Wesley, the Millerites, William Miller, the Baptists, Baptist by immersion, and lastly, the Seventh-day Adventists. The only next church on this continuum is, of course, God's church purified, without spot or blemish. This church is yet future and will happen by God's hand only. He will take the reins in his own hands. And we will see later on in the study that this church will be established by none other than Abraham's seed. So how do we know this? How can we be so sure of this bold assertion? The answer lies in the Bible, God's authoritative word. This is the rule book by which we are to test each doctrine. We will prove by the Bible that the Protestant churches are represented as Israel in these last days, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the last of these Protestant churches to be established, is represented by the term Judah. This secret is revealed through prophetic symbols in the cryptic book of Ezekiel, which we will read in just a few moments. But before we do, let's ask a question to flex your critical thinking caps. Why is it so far-fetched that God would have a movement of people who hold the annals of doctrinal truth in the Christian dispensation? Does the cross obliterate God's reasoning and methods? To be clear, there are differences between the typical system, the Old Testament period, and the anti-typical period. We are no longer in the sacrificial system. But if we study carefully, we will see that God's chain of truth exists in the New Testament period as well. Let's take a closer look at the dispersion of the Christians during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. We must remember that the early Christian church has both Jews and Gentiles, and by intermarrying, they become mixed. But as we will see, God has always kept track of his bloodline. To learn about this history, we read from The Great Controversy, page 40, paragraph 1 and 2.
Persecutions, beginning under Nero about the time of the martyrdom of Paul, continued with greater or less fury for centuries. Christians were falsely accused of the most dreadful crimes and declared to be the cause of great calamities, famine, pestilence, and earthquake. As they became the objects of popular hatred and suspicion, informers stood ready, for the sake of gain, to betray the innocent. They were condemned as rebels against the empire, as foes of religion, and pests to society. Great numbers were thrown to wild beasts or burned alive in the amphitheaters. Some were crucified, others were covered with the skins of wild animals and thrust into the arena to be torn by dogs. Their punishment was often made the chief entertainment at public fetes. Vast multitudes assembled to enjoy the sight and greeted their dying agonies with laughter and applause. Wherever they sought refuge, the followers of Christ were hunted like beasts of prey. They were forced to seek concealment in desolate and solitary places. Destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy, they wandered in deserts, and in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. The catacombs afforded shelter for thousands. Beneath the hills outside the city of Rome, long galleries had been tunneled through earth and rock. The dark and intricate network of passages extended for miles beyond the city walls. In these underground retreats, the followers of Christ buried their dead, and here also, when suspected and proscribed, they found a home. When the life-giver shall awaken those who have fought the good fight, many a martyr for Christ's sake will come forth from those gloomy caverns.
This map shows how the Christian church begins to spread throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. It leaves Jerusalem, the Vineyard, and goes into the wilderness, away from the Holy Land. This movement of God's church is also detailed in Revelation 12. Here, the Church of God is depicted as a woman.
And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God, and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
The woman represents God's church from the beginning of time, separated in 2 divisions. First, the period without the written word is represented by the moon underneath the woman's feet. That is, the moon being a reflection of the sun depicts the oral tradition of father to son, passing on the word of God generation to generation until the time of Moses. With Moses comes the writing of the first 5 books of the Bible, the written word. The period with the Bible is represented as the woman being clothed with the sun. The dragon standing ready to devour the woman's child is the devil starting persecution even before the Messiah even comes. We have on record Herod's diabolical ordering of all male babies to be slain, the subsequent persecution and crucifixion of Christ, the persecution of the apostles and the early Christians. All these events lead to her flight into the wilderness. Since a wilderness is just the opposite of a vineyard, the statement that she might fly into the wilderness emphatically implies that she must have left the vineyard, and that is precisely what she did. Shortly after the resurrection, the church, the woman, left the Holy Land, the vineyard, and went to the land of the Gentiles, the wilderness. We also have the biblical meaning of the vineyard. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant, Isaiah 5:7 says. Unquestionably, therefore, the wilderness, where the woman was nourished for the time being, is the land of the Gentiles. And the woman's having to flee from the face of the serpent in her homeland shows that the dragon had made the Holy Land his headquarters. Not satisfied with this, though, he even followed her into the wilderness.
And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Verse 15.
It is at this exact moment that the devil sees his persecution of the church will not kill this fledgling religion, the gospel of Christ. So instead of persecution, he endeavors to eradicate the religion of Christ by flooding the church with his converts. At this point, Rome adopts Christianity out of a strategy to retain power. A new religion is created through the combination of paganism and Christianity. Pagans are paid to convert to Christianity, and the demolishing of pagan temples is encouraged through governmental inducements and payoffs. Soon, the Sabbath is changed by the church from the seventh day, Saturday, to the first day of the week, Sunday, all in order to appease the pagans.
And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth, and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. The dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ.
Notice that this dragon wars not against a remnant of the flood, but against the remnant of the woman's seed, her seed. Christ, being the woman's only child, her seed are therefore the Christians, those who are born into the church through the Spirit of Christ. Now there is a period of time, the Dark Ages, period of 1260 years, where the Roman Church holds absolute religious power and persecutes the true people of God. This is known as the Dark Ages. Some people call it the Middle Ages. But we want to fast forward to the immigration of Protestants in Europe to the New World. The first Protestants to arrive in the Americas in the early 17th century were theological and religious descendants of the Protestant Reformation. Colonists from Northern Europe introduced Lutheran, Congregational, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Calvinism, Quakerism, Anabaptist, and the Moravian Church to the Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Netherland, Virginia, and Carolina colonies. Let's look at some of these groups. England. A small group of pilgrims who settled the Plymouth colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, seeking refuge from conflicts in England, which led up to the English Civil War. Later came the Puritans, a much larger group than the Pilgrims, who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629 with 400 settlers. Puritans were English Protestants who wished to reform and purify the Church of England in the New World of what they considered to be unacceptable residues of Roman Catholicism. Within 2 years, an additional 2,000 settlers arrived. Beginning in 1630, some 20,000 Puritans immigrated as families to New England to gain the liberty to worship as they chose. Germany. The first group of Germans to settle in Pennsylvania arrived in Philadelphia in 1683 from Krefeld, Germany, and included Mennonites and possibly some Dutch Quakers. These mostly German settlers would become the Pennsylvania Dutch. Germany was also home to perhaps the most famous Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, who translated the New Testament into his native language and preached the Bible and the Bible only. Louis XIV's 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had offered religious freedom to Protestants and ended the Protestant Catholic Wars in France, effectively ended religious freedom for Protestants. As a result of this edict, French Huguenots could either convert to Catholicism, face life in a prison or convent, or flee the country. This led to the diaspora of an estimated 200,000 French Protestant Huguenot refugees. They were spread throughout Europe and North America in what is known as the Le Refuge. These Huguenots often intermingled and intermarried with earlier French Protestant refugees from the Spanish Netherlands. By the time of the American Revolution, many of these refugee families had achieved significant political and economic power in their host nations, often leveraging refugee networks that crossed the Atlantic and spanned generations as part of a larger Protestant international. Let's turn to and read Ezekiel chapter 4.
Thou also, son of man, take thee a tile and lay it before thee, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem, and lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it, set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Moreover, take thou unto thee an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between thee and the city, and set thy face against it, and it shall be besieged, and thou shalt lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity. According to the number of the days, 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Therefore thou shalt set thy face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and thine arm shall be uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it. And behold, I will lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to another, till thou hast ended the days of thy siege. Take thou also unto thee wheat and barley and beans and lentils and millet and fitches, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon thy side. 390 days shalt thou eat thereof. And thy meat which thou shalt eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day. From time to time shalt thou eat it. Thou shalt drink also water by measure, the 6th part of an hin. From time to time shalt thou drink, and thou shalt eat it as barley cakes, and thou shalt bake it with dung that cometh out of man in their sight. And the Lord said, Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I will drive them.
To summarize, Ezekiel is told that he must lie down for a total of 430 days. 390 days for the house of Israel and 40 days for the house of Judah. This is important to note, for this will reveal that this whole dictation is not for ancient Israel, but Christian Israel. There is another important point. Is this time represented by literal days? No, the Bible says in verse 6 that God is giving Ezekiel a day for each year. The time period is actually to be understood in years. So to recap, Ezekiel is lying down to bear the iniquity of Israel for 390 years and the 40 years for Judah. Now, some may say this prophecy is for Israel of old, but with a little research, we will debunk this theory. First, in the text, God consistently uses the verbs shall and will, which communicate a future context.
And the Lord said, Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I will drive them.
Could this period of 430 years be Israel and Judah presently? According to the dates given in the text, Ezekiel received his prophetic call in the 5th year of the first deportation to Babylonian, in 592 BC, and was active until about 570 BC. Remember, the 10 tribes of Israel were carried away by Assyria in 721 BC, approximately 130 years earlier than this date. By 586 BC, much of Judah had been devastated, and the former kingdom had suffered a steep decline of both its economy and its population. Judah was never restored to its former glory, instead existing under varying subjugations under the empires of Medo-Persia, Grecia, and Rome after its captivity in Babylon. In 1948, after World War II, the descendants of Judah began to return to the Holy Land. But this period of time, which ranged from the time the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel was carried away by Assyria to the time that the state of Israel was created in 1948, was too long a span to fit the 430-year period. Now, some scholars say that this prophecy is pointing back to the time when Israel sojourned in Egypt, but there is also a discrepancy there. Yes, the prophecy of Ezekiel 4 deals with a period of 430 years in about the same manner as the prophecy made to Abraham.
And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years.
But Exodus 12:40 says,
Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years.
So there's a 400-year period, and then there's a 30-year period. Ezekiel's prophecy is made exactly the same way in two sections, but not the same number of years in each section. Instead of 400 years, we have 390 years. And instead of 30 years, we have 40, making the same total of 430 in each case. If this prophecy had a reference to the prophecy made to Abraham, it should have been the same number of years in each section. But since it is not the same, it must be another period of time. Again, the prophecy of ancient Israel is that they should sojourn and be afflicted 430 years. But this prophecy of Ezekiel says in verse 13,
And the Lord said, Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I will drive them.
Therefore, it is evident that this prophecy refers to another period of time and experience. The prophecy made to Abraham of 430 years ended at the time the children of Israel went out of Egypt, which is according to Bible chronology in 1491 BC. According to the same chronology, the 430-year period of the children of Israel had ended 896 years before Ezekiel was ever given the vision of his prophecy, and he put the prophecy in the future, for he uses the future tense. So it is altogether impossible for one to form a conclusion that these two prophecies deal with the same period and experience of Israel down in Egypt. And of note, God's use of symbols, as a rule, never point backward but forward as teaching points. The whole sacrificial typical system was used in this manner, to point forward to things to come. Abraham's prophecy, like Ezekiel's, points forward to an experience that his descendants will have in the future. We needn't wrest the scriptures out of their meaning. The only logical thing to do is to put the prophecy in the future, which God has done. We will see Ezekiel's time frame and division of the 430 years fits exactly if we started at the date of the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther received the Bible in 1500 AD. The very first act that Ezekiel is asked to do is to draw a picture of the city on a tile, and using miniature battering rams and other deployments, much like a young child playing with his army toys, set up a battle. In effect, Ezekiel is to lay siege against the city, that is, invade the city, the church, by an army to compel its surrender, endeavor to obtain possession of the city, the church,
and build a fort against it.
A fort around the city makes it secure, so build a fort against it means to make sure that none escape.
And cast a mount.
The word mount in the Greek translation is rendered prohomata, meaning ramparts, which is an embankment surrounding a fort, thus making every effort and precaution to secure the city. That is, he wants Ezekiel to make temporary lodging places. The thought is, make preparation to remain there until you have conquered the city. And if you search the history annals, that was a tactic of ancient armies.
And set battering rams against it round about.
Meaning an instrument with which to blow or strike. Ram is a male sheep, which is also used as a symbol of God's men, and they are to batter around about until the city is taken. So, why is Ezekiel lying down? To bear their iniquity, the iniquity of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. When the early Christian church was born, it immediately suffered persecution by the Roman state. Despite these cruel monstrosities, the church continued to grow. But the devil changed his tactics, flooding the church with his converts. The church suffered a detrimental setback set in motion by the Christianization of Constantine the Great, who endeavored to Christianize the pagans and made laws by which he thought to accomplish peace and conformity. These laws, which uplifted the pagan day of worship, Sunday, and outlawed the Sabbath day, which fell on Saturday, reversed and watered down the church's principles. An amalgamation of Christian and pagan worship created the papal system of worship and cast down the truth of Christ's priesthood, his intercessory work in heaven. It was then the Ten Commandment law was viewed as oppressive in the church, and the church was plunged into a period of darkness known as the Dark Ages. But God always reserved a remnant who kept his commandments despite the oppression that overtook the civilized world. He brought back his children, the seed of Abraham, by birth and by spirit, into truth by measure, starting with Martin Luther in 1500 AD. This is represented by Ezekiel eating the 6 grains little by little. The 6 grains are the same as the Protestant churches. They represent the doctrinal truths each church was founded on. So to get back to the purity of the early Christian church and correct doctrinal truths, God gave the Protestants truth by measure. Ezekiel is told to eat these grains cooked on a fire of a man's dung to show that even though God has raised up these churches and truths, they have been polluted by man's interventions and schemes. The multiplicity of Christian churches and doctrines that have sprouted from these mother denominations testify of this fact. So from 1500 AD to 1890, the year of the birth of the Adventist Church is 390 years. Protestant churches from the Luther to the Millerites are identified as Israel by this period of 390 years. After this period of time was accomplished, God took all the former truths, or grains, and put them all in one vessel with the addition of the Sabbath and the sanctuary truth given by Sister White. Thus, the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was born, and this church was designated with the title Judah. The birth of the Adventist Church is one that was precipitated by a worldwide movement in the Christian churches. This was the Millerite Movement, one that was spurred by the timely fulfillment of biblical prophecies and a Baptist minister's study and interpretation of the 2300 days prophecy in Daniel. Miller believed the sanctuary was the earth and prophesied that in 1843 and then 1844, Jesus would come back to cleanse the sanctuary, which was the earth, a common interpretation in many theologians' views in those times. A mass exodus occurred in the Protestant churches, with many accepting Miller's interpretation and getting ready for the soon coming of their Lord. But Jesus did not come in 1844 to the earth. Some of the Millerites returned to their former churches, but many, though disappointed, decided to go back to the Bible and see where their mistake was. This event was called the Great Disappointment. They realized that although the timepiece was correct in its interpretation, their interpretation of the earth being the sanctuary was all wrong. They found out their mistake by going back to the Old Testament and studying the earthly sanctuary. Enlightenment came to their minds as they realized the work of the earthly priests to atone for the Israelites' sin represented the work that Jesus would do in the heavenly sanctuary in the Christian dispensation. By taking a further look into the ministration of the priest, they realized this atonement was done in the most holy place over the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the ark lay Aaron's rod, a jar of manna, and directly under the mercy seat where the Shekinah, or glory of God, sat, was the Ten Commandment law. With abject horror, they realized that the entire Christian world was observing all the commandments but one.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
So, this great salvage of souls who left their churches and suffered through the great disappointment studied the sanctuary and Jesus' work as a heavenly priest, and in addition, took all the doctrines of their former churches to become Seventh-day Adventists. This is the lineage of truth of the Christian churches and of the seed of Abraham. And let's ask the question, is it so hard to believe when we look at the long history of Israel of old, with their many wanderings and apostasies from God, that we in the Christian dispensation could have suffered the same fate? Israel was taken and scattered many times and gathered back again, and each time they had to learn to return to the religion of their father, Abraham. Now, in the Christian dispensation, Christ will not come until his children have learned the religion of God and who their true mother, his church, is. Now Ezekiel is to lie on his left side for the iniquity of Judah. During this 40-year period lies a cessation of any new testimony of the prophets other than that which has already been given, just as there was an interim between the Old and New Testament, after which Judah will become astonied and realize that the gift of prophecy has been dispatched once again to accomplish and complete its perfect work in the church, the interpretation of all applicable last-day prophecies. The next thing to happen on the continuum of truth is that these messages, 1, the infallibility of God's law, the Sabbath, and 2, Jesus' work as man's intercessor, will go to the rest of the world. Yes, this will be the great test of truth that will come upon all the world, for the false Sabbath, Sunday, will be raised up and eventually enforced right here in the U.S. But by providence, we will see that Abraham's seed will have made their way back to the congregation of God's people, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. To recap, early Christian church was filled with Abraham's seed, those who were faithful Christian Jews and also had the literal blood of Abraham. These Christian Jews went on to spread the gospel to the Gentiles, discarding their Jewish rituals and prohibitions, one of which was mixing with Gentiles through marriage. Eventually, they began to lose their Jewish features and identities and were absorbed into the Gentile nations. These Christians came from the two-tribe kingdom of Judah, the only recognizable Jews at the time of Christ's first advent. As Christianity spread throughout the Old World region, undoubtedly, those Jews who were absorbed into Gentile nations during the carrying away of the Kingdom of Israel, the 10-tribe Northern Kingdom, also could have been converted to Christianity. As we reviewed, the Dark Ages was not caused by persecution, but rather the reaction of the combined efforts of the civil power and the church authorities to it, resulting in the paganizing of the Christian church. The combined church-state government led to the birth and supremacy of the papal rule and the civil enforcement of its decrees, which also resulted in persecution and much death to free-thinking souls. This was the tactic of the devil himself to flood the early church with unconverted souls and, if possible, to eliminate her and her truths from the earth. But God raises up a standard, inspiring holy men of God to speak the truth from his word, starting with Martin Luther. Then starts the movement which will shake the world and tumble the ecclesiastical power of papal Rome, Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation leads to the birth of a nation, found in Revelation 13, the one who comes up as a lamb, but will eventually speak as a dragon, the United States of America. Indeed, the principles of liberty and religious freedom are solidified through the United States divinely inspired Constitution, which ensures at this pivotal time that God's church can thrive, free from the clashes of the old world. One by one, God gives holy men light from his word, and 6 Holy Spirit-led and inspired churches are born: the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Millerite, and finally, the Seventh-day Adventists. In view of this fact and fulfillment of his promises, God has overseen the diaspora of the Jews, which has culminated in the numerous peoples who have made it to the shores of the land of the free. Abraham's seed, through providence and the movement of peoples around the world, enter God's truth in church, and the truths in the Adventist church, in return, have made their rounds the world over, even capturing Abraham's seed abroad.